The sky is a battlefield. Man and machine locked in deadly combat. The pilot, both predator and prey. His gut instincts will determine if he lives or dies. From early biplanes to advanced jets, from machine guns to missiles, using state-of-the-art computer animation, join history's greatest aces. Experience the battle. Relive the dogfights. Fighter planes patrol hostile skies. At any moment, an enemy fighter can attack. The pilots have seconds to react.
I liken it to gladiator work. These are fights to the death. And it only ends when you kill him and he kills you. And they're vicious, violent. They end in a big explosion, a lot of fire, the planes burn. That's what it's about.
Living or dying depends on winning or losing. And you win and you live.
It was a game, in a way. It was the world's most dangerous game.
The first time you are at the controls by yourself and depart Mother Earth, you're changed forever. Forever.
Supersonic jets. Laser-guided missiles. Computer-enhanced controls. These are the tools of modern dogfighting. But the tactics were born in an era of canvas, wood, and wire. The First World War broke out in 1914, just 10 years after the invention of flight. It was a war fought on the ground, at sea, and for the first time, in the air. Small, slow, and fragile, the aircraft were used to observe enemy movements. But soon, pilots were shooting at each other.
Manfred von Richthofen, the famous Red Baron, his first 2 kills were, I believe, from the back seat with a shotgun. They said, though, there's got to be a better way. They mounted a machine gun back there.
The ideal place for guns was at the front of the aircraft. But it wasn't possible to synchronize the firing of the machine gun with the rotation of the propeller. By the autumn of 1915, Dutch aircraft designer Anton Fokker, working for the Germans, revolutionized the air war with a new invention.
The interrupter gear would set forth a series of lever movements. It would prevent the machine gun from firing when the propeller was right in front of the machine gun.
It was a huge success. The Germans had created the first real fighter plane. When the Allies found a downed German fighter with the interrupter gear intact, they copied it in detail. And the skies became a killing field.
The early days of fighter aviation were pretty colorful. 1 in 4 of the fighter pilots didn't survive training. It was a high casualty business back in the early days.
Those who notched up 5 kills earned themselves the much revered title, the Ace.
Only 1 pilot out of 20 becomes an ace, meets that magic 5 victory mark.
But there were no established rules, just trial and error. And error meant almost certain death. The average lifespan for a new pilot was 3 weeks.
These men were very, very brave men. The aircraft could disintegrate. The airplane could just catch on fire. The airplanes had no brakes, no oxygen.
They didn't have parachutes. If the airplane was put out of action, they went down with it because there's no way to get out.
By September 1916, German ace Oswald Bolker published the doctrine for air combat. setting out his 8 rules in a manual called Dicta Bolka. Keep the sun behind you to conceal your position. Follow through on your attack. If you run, you're an easy target. Fire only at close range to ensure hits and save ammunition. Keep your eye on your opponent. Watch out for tricks. Attack from behind, the vulnerable 6 o'clock. If attacked, turn into your opponent. Force him onto the defensive. In enemy skies, keep your line of retreat. Attacking groups, with each aircraft targeting his own opponent. Pilots on both sides learned these rules quickly, or died. In 1917, America joined the war without a fighter plane advanced enough for combat. Instead, they used French aircraft, like the powerful SPAD-13. Among the American pilots was world-famous daredevil racing car driver Eddie Rickenbacker.
I went over with Pershing as a staff driver with the original contingent that went to World War I.
Eager for action, he was quickly transferred to flight school.
There are natural pilots and there are mechanical pilots. And there are those who are sort of in between. He was natural.
Rickenbacker won his first victory on the 29th of April, 1918. By September, he was America's highest-scoring fighter pilot with 8 kills to his name, making him the ace of aces.
He had a tremendous desire to be the leading ace and to fly fighters, and he knew he could do it.
But the title Ace of Aces historically brought 2 things: fame and death. In his autobiography, Rickenbacker wrote, "The possession of this title brought with it unavoidable doom that had overtaken all previous holders. I began to feel this superstition was the heaviest burden I carried into the air, but I could never forget the life of a title holder is short." On the 24th of September 1918, Rickenbacker took command of the 94th Aero Squadron. The squadron scored nearly 70 kills during the war, more than any other American fighter group. Rickenbacker promised his men he would lead by example. At dawn the next morning, the 25th of September, he took off alone in his SPAD-13 to keep that promise. Using state-of-the-art computer animation, relive Eddie Rickenbacker's legendary dogfight. At first, Rickenbacker had the sky to himself. Then he spotted 2 large specks below in the distance. 2 German LVG observation planes, perfect targets. But they weren't alone. Slightly behind, and 1,000 feet above the LVGs, were 5 lethal Fokker D-7 fighters.
The Fokker D-7, without a doubt, was the best fighter plane of World War I. It had a very strong engine. It had low maintenance problems. The SPAD was a very good aircraft too. Very sturdy, and it was really great in a dive.
Rickenbacker's SPAD was faster than the German Fokker, and the 2 aircraft were equally armed, but the Fokker was more maneuverable. Facing odds of 7-1, most pilots would have cut and run. Not Rickenbacker. He climbed, following Bolka's first rule.
He comes out of the sun, that's important. He has the sun to his back and they can't see him.
As the enemy formation passed, Rickenbacker idled his engine, allowing him to attack silently and eliminate the vibration from the engine. Rickenbacker nosed down in a steep dive.
He realizes that he has a chance to attack from the rear quarter. He chooses to pursue his attack on the tail-end Charlie, or that last fighting aircraft, that Fokker.
He then employed Volker's fifth rule: attack the exposed 6 o'clock. The Fokker spotted Rickenbacker. Too late. Rickenbacker opened fire with his 2 Vickers 30 caliber machine guns. The 4 remaining Fokkers, stunned at Rickenbacker's sudden attack, scattered. They knew they'd been attacked, but not from where or by how many. It would take them time to discover there'd only been one enemy. Time for their leader, with no radio and only hand signals, to reform the group.
So he realizes now they're no longer going to be a factor to him. So he then chooses to go ahead and continue on to attack those reconnaissance aircraft.
As the Fokkers dispersed, they left the LVGs unprotected. The LVGs spied Rickenbacker and dived for safety. The aircraft drew apart. The rear gunners fired, but Rickenbacker was out of range. Rickenbacker dived to get out of the line of fire, taking him under the German aircraft. He pulled up to attack the nearest plane's vulnerable belly. The nearest LVG kicked his tail around, giving the gunner a clear shot at the American. Then the second LVG crept in on Rickenbacker's tail, spitting a deadly stream of machine gun bullets at his spad. Rickenbacker was caught in lethal crossfire and in grave danger. On the 25th of September 1918, American ace Eddie Rickenbacker, operating behind enemy lines, attacked 7 German aircraft. He'd taken out 1 Fokker, causing the fighter escort to splinter. He directed his attack against 2 heavily armed LVG observation aircraft. The 4 remaining Fokkers were still trying to regroup. As the LVGs fired, tracer bullets streaked past Rickenbacker's cockpit.
So now Captain Rickenbacker has to find a way to maneuver his aircraft into a position where the LVGs can't shoot. It's pretty tough.
Rickenbacker headed upwards to gain altitude and get out of range. Then he rolled over and dived down to attack the nearest LVG. The LVG carried a 7.92mm Parabellum machine gun which fired 700 rounds per minute, 200 rounds faster than the Spad or the Fokker.
These 2-seaters were very, very dangerous. They were as dangerous as a single-seater Fokker.
The fire from the LVGs thwarted one attack. Rickenbacker, ignoring the danger, repeated his tactic and dived under the LVG to set up his attack and get out of the line of fire. He climbed to strike the LVG's vulnerable belly, but the LVG's heavy crossfire forced him to roll over the top and dive to attack again. But the Germans were expert airmen.
The Germans were particularly skilled in the dogfight. You just didn't realize the environment you were getting into.
Most of their fighter pilots had extensive experience flying 2-seaters on the Russian front. As you also might expect, the Germans saw fighting as a duty.
The World War I German pilots were very effective, amazing amount of kills. They were fighting over their homeland. They actually started teaching tactics. I'd imagine that's part of the reason why they became so effective.
Again, the LVG sideslipped, allowing the rear gunner a clean shot at Rickenbacker. Again, Rickenbacker was forced to climb, roll, and dive for another assault. But the Germans used the same defense, and Rickenbacker was caught in the crossfire. Then the LVGs suddenly and inexplicably made a fatal mistake.
On the 4th pass, for reasons which no one will ever know, The two LVGs separated and gave him some space.
Out of the crossfire, Rickenbacker used the opening to attack the nearest LVG. The Fokker escorts had regrouped and tore to the rescue of the surviving LVG. Rickenbacker saw the Fokkers diving towards him and decided 2 kills was enough.
The 4 Fokker D7s did not follow him. That's not unusual for either side to say the fight is over and we've had enough.
Rickenbacker had faced odds of 7 to 1, destroyed 2 of the enemy, and escaped to fight again.
I came out of World War I without a single scratch. There were more than 150, I would say 160 encounters with the enemy, out of which I got 26 victories.
It wasn't until 1930, however, that his actions that day were awarded with the Congressional Medal of Honor.
I knew that I wanted to be like him. He was my knight in shining armor from the time I was about 8 years old.
In his 1967 autobiography, Rickenbacker wrote, "Courage is doing what you're afraid to do. There can be no courage unless you're scared."
I interviewed a World War I ace, a guy who was 92, and I asked him one time, I said, "You ever get nightmares?" He said, "Yeah, I do." I said, "When was the last time you had one?" He said, "Last night." And I thought they'd kind of fade away with time, but they don't.
The tactics pioneered by the pilots of the First World War have stood the tests of time and the march of technology.
No matter how advanced our weapon systems or aircraft become, the tactics that Rickenbacker and Boelke and those guys developed in World War I are still applicable today.
By the Second World War, just over 20 years later, the fighter had evolved into a powerful weapon, more than 300 miles per hour faster than the Spad.
The changes between World War I fighters and World War II was power. We now have aircraft that have more horsepower, they can go faster, they can go higher. They also carried better weapon systems.
And they carried more guns with longer range, more ammunition, and a bigger punch than the Spad's 2 30 caliber machine guns. Faster planes and more lethal weapons meant less time to react, less margin for error. And the skies of the Second World War would be far more lethal than the First. Since 1943, the Americans had sent massive daylight bombing raids into the heart of Germany, beyond the range of fighter escort. The heavily armed bombers were expected to defend themselves against swarms of enemy fighters.
The daylight raids proved to be quite unsuccessful, and we suffered some heavy losses, losing as many as almost 60 bombers during one mission.
The losses mounted. On the 6th of September 1943, 45 B-17s were destroyed. On the 14th of October, 65 were destroyed by 1,100 German fighters. The U.S. Air Force called it Black Thursday.
600 men went down on that day, and it almost put an end to the daylight bombing. They said, now we've got to have fighter escort. Well, we just can't do this without it.
By late 1943, the Allies finally had a fighter with a range of over 1,300 miles, enough to escort the bombers deep into Germany. The P-51 Mustang. Starting in December, they began escorting the bombers, forcing the Luftwaffe to dogfight over its own skies. On the 27th of May, 1944, American B-17s took off from bases across the south of England. Soon they were in the skies over France. The mission was to destroy German synthetic fuel factories. Escorting the huge formation were P-51 Mustangs. Leading a group of 4 Mustangs was Old Crow, piloted by Captain Clarence Anderson.
I can't remember a time when I wasn't interested in flying. I mean, I had that desire to fly as far back as I can remember in my life.
Anderson earned his Air Corps wings in September 1942 and became a fighter pilot. A year later, he was posted to England to fight the Luftwaffe. His fighter group, the 357th, were the first P-51 Mustang unit in the U.S. 8th Air Force. On the 27th of May, 1944, Clarence Anderson's 4 P-51 Mustangs were escorting an American bombing mission into the heart of Germany when he found himself facing a flight of deadly German Messerschmitt 109s. They were formidable opponents. The P-51 Mustang was one of the Allies' best fighters.
It was a tremendous airplane. It was good at high altitude, good at low altitude. It was very maneuverable. I think in the hands of a good pilot, it could hold its own or do better than any of the enemy airplanes.
The Me-109 entered service in 1937. A stalwart of the Luftwaffe, over 35,000 were produced, more than any other fighter in history.
The strengths of the 109 were that it was a very small but very fast aircraft. It was very difficult to see. It had a very low profile, and it also had a very good zoom rate. It could climb very quickly.
Although the P-51 was faster, turned tighter, and flew over 3,000 feet higher, the Me-109 was more heavily armed and a battle-hardened veteran, as were the men who flew them.
The German pilots had so much more experience and so much more flying time than the Allied fighter aircraft. Some of these pilots have been flying since 1935 and flew into the 40s, and this is one of the reasons why you saw such incredible kill rates, with some of these pilots getting 200 or 300 aerial victories.
Anderson had one advantage that the fighters of the First World War lacked. Improvements in electronics now enabled aircraft to carry a radio.
We hear on the radio that up front, ahead of us, they were being attacked. My wingman's on the inside. He calls out, hey, we got 4 bogies, unidentified airplanes, attacking us, coming down on us from 5 o'clock high. We're very vulnerable.
The opening moves of a dogfight are critical. Anderson could go left, right, straight, climb or dive. If he turned left, he'd be in the angle of attack. If he went straight, the Messerschmitt would overtake him, its dive giving it superior speed. His only hope was to break right. The German was going too fast to make the sharp turn.
So we turn like this very hard.
Anderson flew half a circle, then went head-on towards the Germans. The two groups passed each other. When the Messerschmitts turned left, so did the Mustangs. A lethal game of hunter and hunted, as each side tried to get on the other's vulnerable 6 o'clock.
Now we got 4 Me-109s. And got 4 Mustangs coming around. They want to fight. So they're coming around. And we're coming around now in a big left circle. This goes about 2 times. Each time we come around, I'm a little closer to getting in trail with them. So we've turned their advantage now to our advantage.
Anderson was here, the Germans here. The Mustangs' tighter turn gave them an inside track. The smaller turning radius allowed the Mustangs to close in. Anderson's plan was to use this advantage to get on the Me-109's tail, line up, and fire.
You do all this stuff by instinct. You don't have it all figured out. You do it instinctively.
The Mustang's 4 50-caliber machine guns carried nearly 1,300 rounds, just 20 seconds of ammunition. Anderson needed to make every shot count.
We were all young, indestructible, I hope. I knew it was a lie, but you had to think that way.
The Germans spotted the Mustangs closing the range and made a run for it. But with a top speed of 441 miles per hour, the P-51 was more than 50 miles an hour faster than the Me-109. Then one Messerschmitt broke away from the pack and climbed.
I'm looking at this guy, and I don't want to get too far up or he can drop down on me.
Anderson sent 2 of his Mustangs, led by Eddie Simpson, after it. Anderson and his wingman, John Skara, went after the other 3 German aircraft. Using his Mustang's superior speed, Anderson got within 300 yards of the Messerschmitt.
When you shoot somebody down, the best way to do it is to get right here, what we call 6 o'clock. That's what I did with this guy.
The damaged 109 then did something that amazed Anderson. He kept flying upside down.
And I thought, what the heck's he doing, you know? If he's going to run away, he just would roll over and pull away. I'm sitting there right side up very comfortably and pumped some more shells into him.
It was Anderson's 6th kill of the war. It was now 2 against 2. Anderson could tell the Germans were nervous. One dived to escape. The other climbed and turned. He still wanted to fight, clearly an experienced dogfighter.
When you saw a German airplane, you treated him like the Red Baron. I mean, you used every advantage you had over him, and without the knowledge of knowing who was in that airplane.
Anderson tried to follow the Me-109, which had turned a hard left. Anderson realized he was going too fast to make the turn. He passed the Messerschmitt and climbed, trying to gain the advantage. He was now above the German. If the Messerschmitt continued to turn, Anderson could drop on him. If he dived, he could give chase. But the Me-109 skillfully reversed his turn, pulling a hard right, and maneuvered behind the Mustangs. Anderson was in front, his wingman, John Skara, right behind. It was now Skara who had the German on his tail. Anderson told Skara to dive, hoping the German would follow.
I'll drop in behind him. Maybe we can get him that way. So John did that. Sure enough, boy, he went right after him.
At over 400 miles an hour, Anderson dived after the Messerschmitt still on Skara's tail.
He sees that right away. He comes out, straightens out, pulls away, then he comes around on this hard turn again.
The German had pulled the same maneuver. Left turn, hard right. Using Bolker's 5th rule, he was now on Anderson's tail.
Now I've got the problem, so I pull the airplane up as steep as I want to, full power, got everything just going as I can. I know that I've got a little more energy than it is, but I'm thinking about plan B.
Energy, or airspeed, meant life. Anderson was in trouble. It was the only time in his Air Force career that an enemy fighter was behind him, making an almost perfect attack.
Here you are, one-on-one. Kill or be killed. There's big odds that you might not make it. You might be killed in this thing. And you wonder inside, how am I going to perform personally? Am I going to run or am I going to fight? You don't know. I mean, you can train, but the actual thing is real. It's real.
One hit from the German's 30mm cannon could shred his Mustang. Life or death was just seconds away. American ace Clarence Anderson had shot down one German fighter. Now another Me-109 was tight on his tail. Anderson climbed for his life.
I can see that hole in the prop where the big cannon is, and I'm in big trouble if he can get that gun pointed right at me.
The Rheinmetall Borsig Mark 108 cannon fired 650 30mm shells a minute. Its 30mm shell was nearly 3 times larger than the P-51's 50 caliber. 5 hits could knock down a B-17. 1 hit could rip apart Anderson's Mustang.
I look back there, and man, that thing looked like an elephant gun to me. I'm pulling up. We're both losing airspeed at a pretty significant rate. And pretty soon, one of us is going to stall first, and whoever does that is going to be in big trouble.
When an aircraft flies upwards, it fights gravity, loses speed, and eventually stalls and drops. If the German stalled first, Anderson would dive on his tail. But if Anderson stalled first, he would slip down below the ME-109 and be blown out of the sky. Both aircraft soared upwards. Both pilots were climbing for their lives.
He has to lead me, and he's actually below me. I see him pulling, so I'm pulling. We're both pulling.
With the throttle full forward, Anderson had taken his P-51 to the limit. Then Anderson saw what he'd been praying for.
I see the airplane shudder. He's starting to lose control.
The Messerschmitt had run out of airspeed and lift. It shuddered, stalled, then plummeted. 2 seconds later, Anderson's more powerful Mustang also shuddered, but didn't stall, and he dived down after the German. Regaining control, the ME-109 broke hard to his left. Anderson decided to go for the kill, but it required a tricky, dangerous move. The Messerschmitt was here. Anderson here behind him. The German continued his sharp left turn. Anderson tried to follow. If he didn't make the turn, he'd be in front of the German, out of speed, a sitting duck. Anderson was sure his Mustang would make it. It did. Anderson was now directly behind the ME-109. Now it was the German who was climbing, trying to escape. Anderson knew the Messerschmitt would stall before he did, and fixed on the German 6 o'clock.
I start firing right in here, and I saw some tracers go across his right wing a little bit. I pushed a little bit of left rudder, and then pow! Hit him right in the middle, right in the wing root, all around the cockpit and engine area. Tremendous white vapor came out initially.
Although the Messerschmitt had been hit, it was still intact.
And then he just suspended in the air. I'm so close I can see the wheel well and the rivets and the grease and everything. He just rolls over and goes down. I followed him down through 20,000 feet. I was going faster than I ever been in my life. I was going too fast, and I pulled the throttle back. Well, he was smoking now. He's just black smoke pouring out. It must have been a mile long, and he's just going straight down. I see his shadow, and he and his shadow met.
It was a triumphant day for Anderson and the 3 other Mustangs. Attacked by 4 enemy aircraft, they broke the attack, then turned the tables, destroying 3 of the enemy. Of the B-17 bombers dispatched on that mission and escorted by the Mustangs, only 12 were missing. The Germans had lost over 34 fighters. The raids on the synthetic fuel factories were a success. In only 2 months, Germany's oil production was halved. The Mustang and men like Clarence Anderson saved the daylight bombing campaign thousands of lives and turned an Allied disaster into victory. As the Germans gradually lost their veteran pilots, new, poorly trained replacements became cannon fodder for the Allied fighters. By the end of the war, the Allies had decimated the once mighty Luftwaffe and controlled the skies over Germany. Anderson flew 116 missions in his old Crow and had 16 kills. Although he never sustained any serious injuries, Some of his squadron mates were not so lucky.
I had a tremendous relationship with the members of my squadron. I thought so much of them that I actually named my son after two of them, and both of them were killed in combat. Jim Browning was one. He later got shot down when he made a head-on pass with a German jet, Me-262, and they collided. Both of them were killed. Eddie Simpson was the other one. He was my wingman.
Anderson would stay in the United States Air Force, serving in post-war Korea and flying in combat in Vietnam. He retired in 1972. Chuck Yeager, his friend and squadron mate, called Clarence Anderson the best fighter pilot he ever knew. The piston-engine fighter reached its zenith in the Second World War. Yet even before the war had ended, its days were numbered, and the sound of air combat would change forever. Towards the end of the war, both the Allies and the Germans deployed jets. But the German Me-262 was a nasty shock for the Allies. The Germans had discovered that swept-back wings added speed, and its powerful jet engines made it 100 miles an hour faster than the Mustang, impossible to catch in the air. But they were too few and too late to affect the Allied victory. As the war neared its end, it became obvious that jets were the future. Jets were fast, but their engines consumed huge amounts of fuel, creating new problems.
One, you were restricted in range compared to your P-51 in War II. Things happen at greater range, faster. Closure rates, turn radius larger.
They accelerated the pace of dogfighting, with less time to spot the enemy. Closing speed, called merge, was cut in half. Although machines could be changed to take the added stress, the man in the cockpit couldn't. Extreme high-speed turns created G-forces that pushed the pilots past human limits.
Someone weighs 200 pounds. A force of 5 Gs would be the equivalent of 1,000 pounds pushing down on them. 7.5 Gs would be equivalent of 1,500 pounds. It feels like it's taking your face and it's stretching it down over your knees, down onto the floor.
The main result of that force is causing the blood to pool in the lower extremities. First thing affected the eyes. Blood begins to drain out of the eye and begin to lose vision. So someone who is not prepared to handle that quick onset of G can very easily black out and pass out.
The greater speeds required special G-suits to protect the pilots against the extreme pressures of G-forces. Experts predicted that the increased speed of the jets and stress on the pilots would make dogfighting obsolete. That theory was soon put to the test. In June 1950, 6 divisions of the North Korean People's Army swarmed across the 38th parallel, the border between North and South Korea. East and West were at war, and for the first time, jets fought jets. Major Frederick Blessé became America's leading ace in Korea. Being a fighter pilot had been in Blessé's blood since childhood.
I'd want to be an ace since I first started reading about Eddie Rickenbacker in the 1920s. And that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to go to West Point, I wanted to be a fighter pilot, and then I wanted to be as good a fighter pilot as the Air Force had.
Blessé graduated from West Point in 1945, too late to see combat in the Second World War, but made up for that in Korea, flying over 200 missions. The goal of many of these missions was simple: to destroy enemy fighters. Since November 1950, the skies had been dominated by a fast, high-climbing opponent, the MiG-15. Some were flown by hastily trained North Korean and Chinese pilots. but others were secretly flown by Russians. These Second World War veterans were well-trained and experienced dogfighters.
The MiG was a formidable opponent because it would do a lot of things that you couldn't do. And the main thing you had to be careful of was not fighting his fight. The MiG had a better climb rate and a better turn rate at 15 and 25,000 feet, and above 25,000, it had about twice the rate of climb as the F-86 did.
The MiG was also heavily armed with a 37mm cannon and two 23mm machine guns. The only American fighter that could match the MiG-15 was the F-86 Sabre. Built by North American Aviation, the same company that built the Mustang, the Sabre drew on captured German research and was the first swept-winged fighter in the US Armed Forces. Armed with 6 50-caliber machine guns, it was ideal for jet combat, but lacked the stopping power of the MiG's Russian cannon. It could also dive faster than the MiG and was more stable. Its radar-directed gun sight was more accurate, but the MiG-15 could climb higher and faster and was more heavily armed. On the 2nd of October 1952, Major Frederick Blessé was leading his 123rd mission. His flight of 4 F-86s were tracking down enemy aircraft over the most hazardous piece of sky in the war, MiG Alley, which stretched from the northeast end of the Yellow Sea along the Yalu River. MiGs would dart out from their air bases, attack American bombers, then dash back over the Chinese border. Close to their bases, the MiGs had a huge advantage over the Sabres, which were several hundred miles from theirs, and carried only enough fuel for 20 minutes over MiG Alley. Blessé and his flight were coming to the end of their patrol.
We had 4 guys, and the number 4 man was the new guy, but the element leader had some problems with his fuel system.
Blessé sent the element leader home, escorted by one of the other Sabres, and kept the new, inexperienced pilot with him.
Eventually, we got down to the point where we were well into Manchuria, and said, okay, it's time to go home.
Flying at 31,000 feet, they turned south. They were 200 miles from home and had a lot of enemy territory to cross.
We were still well north of Sinuiju in North Korea, and I see 4 MiGs above me about 8 or 10,000 feet. We didn't have the fuel to fight. We were a hell of a long way from home, and we were really not quite over the water yet. It was not a good position.
Blessé dived, hoping to outrun the MiGs. But the lead MiG pilot, even though he was out of range, fired. His two 23mm cannon and 37mm gun delivered a mass of flame. The wingman broke away from Blessé, turning left.
So as soon as he broke out to the left like that, the 2 MiGs started cutting him off in the turn.
He'd fallen into the MiG's trap. The MiG cut inside the Sabre's turn, closing the range.
And I called my wingman and said, put that sucker in a 4G turn and keep it there. Then he just started a descending spiral. And the 2 MiGs were behind him trying to do the same thing.
The fast turn and defensive spiral made it hard for the MiGs to get a good shot.
And I'm behind those 2 MiGs. And when I looked right after I got into a turn and started on these guys, I took a look to see what the other element was doing, and they're turning in on me. So we had a nifty little daisy chain going down with a 1-2, 1-2 deal.
At 18,000 feet, Blessé got the break he was hoping for. The closest MiG in front of him couldn't hold the spiral and slid outside the tight turn.
And when he did that, I relaxed the G's on my airplane and lined him up in my gun sight.
In a spiral, G-forces pull on bullets, making it almost impossible to get an accurate shot. But Blessé was an expert marksman.
A bunch of stuff flew off of him, some stuff out of the engine puff, and off he went. He took off.
Leaving the MiG on his wingman's tail unprotected, the MiG rolled away and escaped to avoid becoming Blessé's next victim. But Blessé still had 2 MiGs on his tail and ordered his wingman to fly home. The 2 remaining MiGs started shooting at Blessé's canopy.
I'm in a turn because these guys have just fired over my canopy. I increased the Gs and made them slide out to the right. And then I started to reverse my turn.
Using his training and experience, he pulled up, reversed into the MiG, then rolled over into a dive. He was now above and behind the MiGs, ready to attack.
And the minute I did that, this guy could see that he was going to be had if he didn't do something. So instead of trying to turn with me, he just rolled into me and headed for the deck, and his wingman went with him.
With no choice, he let the MiGs escape.
I didn't want to fight with him. I didn't have the fuel. But now I'm down to about 900 pounds, maybe 1,000 pounds of fuel. I'm damn near 200 miles from home. And I'm already starting to calculate whether I can make it or not.
To conserve his precious fuel, he climbed to 11,000 feet. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spied another MiG on his 10 o'clock, closing fast.
I thought, boy, school is really out. I can't even go one turn with this guy. I don't have the fuel. Above all, I've got to get out over the water.
Still over North Korea, Blessé was a long way from the Allied-controlled sea. Enemy propaganda broadcasts had singled him out by name. As America's leading ace, he was a sought-after prize.
It hadn't been more than 2 weeks since Pyongyang Sally had been on the shortwave radio, and she said, "Oh, Major Blessé, I see you got your 8th kill today, but we're going to get you, and when we do, we're going to hang you from the Han River Bridge."
Incredibly, the MiG hadn't seen the Sabre, which was low and to his right. Blessé faced a hard choice. If he went for the MiG, he risked using the fuel he needed to get back.
I'm thinking, why does this happen to me when I go on mission after mission after mission, and I got all kinds of fuel and I can't find them, and here I am when I don't barely have enough fuel to get to the water, and here's somebody to fight with. I said, oh, what the hell, why not? And I flipped it over into a turn, pulled up close to him. I came up underneath him and shot him down.
It was Blessé's 10th kill, but it had cost him 200 pounds of much-needed fuel. Now alone, over enemy territory, he was in trouble. On the 2nd of October, 1952, in the skies over North Korea, Major Frederick Blessé destroyed an enemy MiG, but his fuel tanks were now dangerously low.
I got 3 alternatives right now. I would like to get all the way home. If that doesn't happen, if the winds are wrong, I don't have enough fuel, maybe I can get to Panyang-do.
Panyang-do Island had an Allied radar station and 5,000 feet of hard, sandy beach. It was an emergency landing field, but with treacherous risks.
The only problem with it was it had about a 50-foot cliff on each end of the landing strip. But if you're looking at bailing out into the 3rd most shark-infested bay in the world, or maybe taking a crack at that 5,000-foot runway, it doesn't look too bad.
Blessé still hoped to make it to his base in Kempo. He shut off his engine to save his last dregs of fuel and glided at 180 knots, the Sabre's best gliding speed. But within minutes, his Sabre losing altitude and the wind against him, Blessé knew he couldn't make it back to Kempo or even Panyangdo Island. His best hope was to eject into the shark-infested sea. He restarted his engine. Using his last drops of fuel, he climbed back to 13,000 feet and headed for the coast. Then, well over North Korea, he ran out of fuel.
I got over the coastline. Took a tremendous amount of fire.
Heavy 57mm anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. With no fuel, Blessé couldn't weave to avoid the ground fire. The flak burst so close, the air pressure forced his wings up. He ran the gauntlet and dashed to the sea, crossing the coast at only 3,000 feet. On his radio, one by one, his squadron mates tried to keep his spirits up.
This still kind of chokes me up thinking about it. It was a very, very emotional moment for me. I remember after the last guy stopped, I sat there for a full 8 or 10 seconds and I thought, God, what a wonderful, wonderful bunch of guys.
Ejecting from a jet aircraft is extremely hazardous. The sudden G-forces can cause severe spinal injury. Arms and legs not tightly controlled can be severed by the windscreen canopy or cockpit walls. Out of the cockpit, the parachute opening can snap the body again, intensifying injuries. Blessé ejected. He and his seat with parachute attached were blown out of the aircraft. Luck was on his side as his parachute unfolded and he hit the water safely. Within 10 minutes, Dumbo, the air-sea rescue flying boat, swept down to pick up Blessé as all around them enemy shells exploded. The following day, Blessé attended a press conference in Japan before being sent home as America's top jet ace. By the end of the war, the US Air Force had lost 78 Sabres, but shot down 793 MiGs, a kill ratio of 10-1. This air supremacy kept Allied ground forces from being pushed into the sea by overwhelming numbers.
We were dominant because we had a bunch of fighter pilots that were very highly experienced, and we had a good airplane, and we were taught ahead of time by our intelligence people what the MiG could do in relation to what we could do. That coupled with hours and hours and hours of dogfighting in the U.S., down in our hearts somewhere, we thought the time is going to come when I can use all this.
In 1955, after the war, Blessé took the hard lessons he'd learnt in Korea and wrote, "No guts, no glory." It became the Bible for fighter pilots. Where Bolker's dicta laid out fighter combat in broad strokes, "No guts, no glory" gave pilots the in-depth nuts and bolts tactics, the tools of survival and victory.
No guts, no glory, great concepts on mutual support, which we still publish today. Basic defensive maneuvers that are put out in that are still applicable today.
Although the Sabre at 679 miles per hour was over 200 miles per hour faster than the P-51 Mustang, they had one thing in common. They both fought with guns, and that meant getting close to the enemy. But the US Navy, concerned that Soviet bomber attacks could threaten its aircraft carriers, needed a weapon that could destroy the enemy at long range. In the mid-1950s, the rocket-powered Sidewinder missile changed air combat forever. By the time of the Vietnam War, the Sidewinder could accelerate in seconds to a speed of Mach 2.5, over 3 times faster than most jets, and their heat-seeking sensors could lock in on a target's tailpipe from over 2 miles. Improved missiles, like the longer-range Sparrow, followed. With the ability to kill far beyond gun range, the experts declared that dogfighting was obsolete, just as they had with the coming of jets.
Why did the experts think dogfighting was obsolete? Ha! That really evokes a flood of emotion, memories. Who were the experts, pray tell? People who'd been promoted beyond their capability, way beyond their usefulness, who'd never fought, who looked at manuals, who looked at, I don't know what the hell they looked at.
In the late 1950s and 60s, dogfight training was minimized. The Navy's new interceptor, the F-4 Phantom, was designed to shoot down Soviet bombers only with long-range missiles.
Remember, the leadership didn't think there was going to be any more dogfights. It was only going to be shooting missiles at a Russian bomber coming across the ocean. So why would you need a gun? The Navy decided not to put a gun in the airplane. Mistake.
Some pilots, like Robin Olds, a Second World War ace and future Vietnam commander, pushed for conventional dogfight training.
I was called in to account by my boss, who was a two-star general in the basement of the Pentagon, who very mildly chiding me, "Robin, I'm tired of these staff studies of yours about our lack of conventional capability. Mind you, Colonel, we're never again going to fight a conventional war." And I looked at him and thinking to myself, "General, where have you been since 1945? What do you think we've been doing?"
America's reliance on high tech would face a dangerous and bloody reality. Early on in the Vietnam War, America wasn't achieving anything like the kind of air superiority it had in past conflicts.
There was a gentleman by the name of Captain Frank Alt that did a report called the Alt Report, because our senior admiral said, "Why do we shoot so many missiles and not hit anybody? What's going on?"
In 1969, Alt's report made 242 recommendations. One stood out above all others.
He said, "The problem we're having is the pilots don't know how to dogfight. They've gotten away from the in-close dogfight because we thought the technology was going to dictate that that was no longer a necessity."
In 1969, the U.S. Navy established Top Gun, the fighter weapons school, specifically to teach pilots dogfighting. Fighter crews undergo intensive training in air combat maneuvering and weapons systems employment. The 4-week course provides instruction that simulates real combat conditions. The invaluable dogfight training from this school would help earn Randall Cunningham and Willie Driscoll a place in history over the skies of Vietnam. Commissioned into the U.S. Navy in 1967, Cunningham's love of John Wayne films earned him the nickname Duke.
I was with Duke Cunningham during the entire combat cruise, and he was 24 hours, 7 days a week. He would just as soon skip lunch and go read up something in the book. Very dedicated to his craft. And as I found out in reading up about gentlemen like Oswald Boelke and Manfred von Richthofen, they were the same way.
In 1972, Duke Cunningham was a pilot aboard the USS Constellation, flying the Navy's newest fighter, the F-4 Phantom. The Phantom divided the workload between two men, the pilot and the radar intercept officer, or RIO. Cunningham's RIO was Lieutenant J.G. Willie Driscoll.
And the idea behind it was to take some of the burden off the pilot so that he wouldn't have to worry about flying the plane, running the electronic countermeasures, deploying chaff and flares, running the radios, running the radar and all this. At the same time working together, two sets of eyes and two sets of brains are better than one.
Cunningham and Driscoll trained together, becoming a formidable fighting team.
We knew each other's tendencies, its strengths and weaknesses. We're welded at the hip, as brothers might be, when you go through something like that.
That training would prove invaluable when, on a day in 1972, they found themselves heavily outnumbered in their F-4 Phantom over North Vietnam by a range of Soviet-built fighters, including the notorious MiG-17. This modernized version of the MiG-15 was a nimble and formidable opponent. At low speed, it could easily outturn the Phantoms.
The thing that the MiG had was a small airplane, small size, hard to see.
Size wasn't the F-4's only disadvantage.
The F-4, large, bulky, leaves two big smoke trails when it's not an afterburner. Easy to see, therefore, at long distances. Whoever gets visual first has got a much better advantage. In fact, surprise is one of the elements in the combat arena that's historic.
With a top speed of nearly 1,500 miles per hour, the American F-4 Phantom was twice as fast as the MiG-17. Armed with 2 medium-range Sparrow and 4 short-range Sidewinder missiles, the F-4 could strike from over 25 miles away. Although the MiG was more agile than the Phantom, the F-4 was faster and had a better rate of climb. The MiG's biggest advantage was its armament. In addition to missiles, it also carried short-range guns that the Phantom lacked. On the 10th of May, 1972, Randy Cunningham was piloting the F-4 Phantom Showtime 100 into the skies of North Vietnam when he was caught in one of the most savage dogfights of the jet age. On the 10th of May, 1972, Randy Cunningham and Willie Driscoll in their F-4 Showtime 100 were on a 35-aircraft raid against the Hai Dong rail yards.
I remember it was a beautiful day, just wispy clouds going through the skies, and you know, as you're climbing in a fighter and you're looking at that armada that you're joining and stuff, it's pretty awesome to look at the power, and at the same time, I'd already lost some good friends. It was deadly serious and earnest, and you didn't want to make mistakes.
Cunningham's Phantom was also armed with bombs for ground attack. The North Vietnamese were determined to shred the strike force and launch MiGs from 5 airfields protecting the rail yards with anti-aircraft guns and surface-to-air missiles, like the SAM SA-2. After dropping their bombs on enemy warehouses, Cunningham and Driscoll loitered to cover the A-7 attack aircraft, the Navy bombers. Cunningham's wingman was Brian Grant.
I told Willie, I said, look at that target we just hit, because we decimated the whole thing. Were secondary explosions. But about that time, Brian Grant spoke up and he said, Dukes, MiG-17's at 7 o'clock.
2 MiG-17s swooped down behind their 2 Phantoms. Tracer flashed by their cockpit. The MiGs were traveling fast. Cunningham knew at top speed the MiG, lacking hydraulic controls like the F-4, was hard to turn.
So I looked at him and I said, no, you can't do it. Broke into him and he overshot right down below me.
But the second MiG, 1,500 feet behind, rolled up to Cunningham's belly. Brian Grant and his Rio, Jerry Sullivan, told Cunningham they'd take care of the second MiG, leaving Cunningham free to deal with the MiG that overshot him.
I put my nose on him and come through him. I get a Sidewinder tone and squeeze the trigger. The missile literally went up his tailpipe and exploded.
It was Cunningham and Driscoll's 3rd kill of the war. The MiG that had been under Cunningham's belly was still there. Cunningham accelerated, putting on 500 knots, and made his escape from the MiG. Having fled the danger, Cunningham and Driscoll decided to go after more enemy aircraft. They pitched up, went over the top, rolled out in a maneuver known as an Immelmann turn, named after the German ace Max Immelmann, and headed back to the fight. Below, they spied 2 Phantoms trapped in a wheel of 8 circling MiGs, and in danger.
MiGs would fly in a wagon wheel, MiG-17, 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 all the way around, and there was 8 of them. The tactic that they use If you get behind one of them, there'll always be a MiG behind you. If you don't get in there with them, you fly tangent to it and you go through and shoot them and then go out the other side and keep your speed up. But in that wheel was 2 other Phantoms.
As Cunningham started to head in, an F-4 shot out of the circle, so close they nearly collided. Its commander was Dwight Timm, Cunningham's executive officer. His Rio, Jim Fox. Timm was here, with 2 MiGs on his 5 o'clock, which he saw. But he hadn't seen a MiG-17 on his wing, closing in to attack. Cunningham fell in behind and called for the F-4 in port turn to break away. With Timm's Phantom and the attacking MiG close together, the Sidewinder couldn't lock on to the enemy plane. If Cunningham fired, the missile could lock on Timm. Cunningham again warned Timm to break right.
He really yelled it out loud, at which point every F-4 out there broke right.
Timm had been focusing on the MiGs at his 5 o'clock and quickly accelerated, then broke hard right. The MiG turned, but at this speed couldn't match the move. Some American pilots referred to enemy pilots as gomers.
Knowing the enemy's airplane helps because a MiG-17 doesn't have hydraulically boosted controls. It takes a big gomer in there to pull that pole when he's got all that speed and that G and then nose downhill.
Finally, Cunningham had a clear shot at the MiG. It was Cunningham and Driscoll's 4th kill. Then 4 MiG-21s, watching the fight from above, decided to roll in for revenge. The MiG-21 was a fast, agile, and feared opponent.
It'd be stupid to take on a MiG-21 in his best operating envelope, which is higher. He out-accelerates you, out-climb you, and out-turn you. If you don't have the advantage, run. Go home. Come back the next day. Smart.
Cunningham decided it was time to retreat. He pulled hard, turned in the opposite direction from the MiGs, and headed back to his carrier. As they approached the coast at 10,000 feet, they spotted a MiG-17 heading towards them.
I said, Willie, we got a MiG, 12 o'clock. Try and lock him up. He couldn't get a lock. And I said, I'm going to scare the blank out of this MiG. And so I passed right down with full intention, just scaring the heck out of him.
But Cunningham made an almost fatal error.
He started to shoot at us with his gun. We major mistake, perhaps we forgot that that's right, they have their gun equipped.
I broke and went vertical and rolled to try and see him because Hanoi was that way. Any MiG that we ever engaged that hadn't had a real advantage, they'd run.
The 2 men looked back, expecting to see the retreating MiG.
Instead of running, he had pulled and gone vertical with me. Now I'm looking at probably 300-400 feet. Close enough I could look in and see a little set of Gomer goggles, little Gomer scarf that he had on his neck, and we're going canopy to canopy with a MiG-17 like this.
Cunningham lit his afterburners and climbed above the MiG. His second near-fatal error in minutes. The MiG was now on his 6 o'clock and opened fire.
It was a big mistake. And, you know, I was thinking about recovering from it, and, you know, your fangs come out at that point, and your mind says, okay, settle down, Duke.
Cunningham rolled off to the side to escape the deadly line of bullets. But the MiG matched his every move.
The only rule was there were no rules. It was a knife fight in a telephone booth.
After all they'd been through, Cunningham and Driscoll were still in for the fight of their lives. Most North Vietnamese pilots rarely fought in the vertical. They either fought in the horizontal or ran. This pilot was different. He had skill, expertise, and a killer's instinct.
I look and I'm looking right at his eyeballs. And I mean, it's like looking at a cobra ready to strike you. And that chill going through your spine, it's every emotion you've ever felt: fear, hate, anger, love. All of those emotions, magnify them 1,000%. And what helps you is that if you panic, then you're vulnerable. And that's where your training kicks back in.
Cunningham and Driscoll set a trap. They nosed down to gain speed. The MiG, taking the bait, did the same. Cunningham pulled up, rolled over the top of the MiG, and positioned himself behind him, a maneuver called the rolling scissors. The MiG employed Cunningham's same maneuver and pulled up into him.
I overshot. And then I accelerated again and said, okay, this guy knows what a rolling scissor is.
Each aircraft attempted to roll into his opponent's 6 o'clock. They climbed and rolled, each trying to get into the attack position behind the other.
We're noting that this pilot is flying this plane very well, and he's also handling his weapon system very well. Very different from what we'd encountered with the other enemy pilots. This fellow knew just what he was doing and just how to do it.
As the two jets maneuvered, fighting gravity, they lost speed.
It was a three-dimensional rolling fight, and we went through maybe 2 or 3 of these rolls. The last time we knew that is when we went up to the vertical, we were going to run the risk of stalling or go to zero airspeed, in which case, if he had a little bit more airspeed than us, he was going to be able to kill us.
At low speed, the smaller MiG could easily outturn the big American jet.
I don't fight his fight. I don't get into a turning fight with him because that's his fight. I'll force him into the vertical, or I'll force him to do something else that I want. When you set a trap for somebody, you also are cognizant that another good pilot could be setting a trap for you.
Cunningham knew it was time to turn the fight around. He fired his afterburners, dumping raw fuel into his exhaust to gain more speed, and at 600 knots darted 2 miles away from the MiG, ending the rolling scissors. Cunningham and Driscoll took a second pass at the MiG, this time angled to the side so the MiG couldn't fire head-on. Cunningham then began to climb. So did the MiG, starting another rolling scissors.
He would force me to overshoot, use rudder, kick like this. Very experienced pilot.
Staying in the rolling scissors maneuver, Cunningham began to lose speed. The MiG had twice gained the advantage. For the second time, Cunningham hit his afterburners, putting 2 miles between his Phantom and the MiG. Then roared back to attack. He pitched his nose up 60 degrees and started climbing. Again, the MiG followed him. He then tried a trick he'd learned at Top Gun. He hit his air brake and idled his throttle, slowing down the Phantom. Cunningham knew the MiG was expecting him to overtake and pass, placing the MiG on the Phantom's 6 o'clock. For Cunningham, slowing down was a dangerous move. He could easily stall and lose control of his aircraft, giving the MiG a huge advantage.
One of the things we always teach at Top Gun is we want our pilots to fly that airplane 1 inch from out of control at all times in a purposeful way. And that's what Duke is doing with this airplane right now.
It worked. The MiG shot out in front and above him.
It's like if you put on your brakes, a car is going to go by you on the highway. That's what I was trying to do to get him.
Finally, Cunningham and Driscoll had the advantage. If Cunningham had had a gun, he could have shot the MiG out of the sky. But all he had were missiles, and he was too close to use them.
but I made another mistake. I expected that relative motion to keep going like this, but he ran out of speed, and I ended up about 700 to 800 feet away from him. And I can't shoot him because the missile won't arm at that point unless it just hits him.
The MiG pilot knew he was in desperate trouble and rolled over the top, away from Cunningham and Driscoll. At the top of the roll, he briefly stalled and headed into a dive. He recovered with Cunningham and Driscoll behind him. The MiG then headed for the ground, opening the range, but hoping the ground heat would prevent the Sidewinder's heat seeker from locking onto him.
He just kept running. So when he got nose to tail position, about 2,000 feet, I just stood on the rudder like this, pointed the nose at him, and shot him.
It was Cunningham and Driscoll's 5th kill. They later discovered that the great adversary may have been the legendary Colonel Toome, widely believed to be North Vietnam's #1 ace. But the celebrations would have to wait. Cunningham and Driscoll were still a long way from home. With more MiGs closing in, they rolled out and headed for the coast.
And as I rolled, look up, I could just see a SAM coming, an SA-2. It's about the size of a telephone pole.
The SA-2 had a top speed of Mach 3.5, over 2,660 miles per hour. It could obliterate jets at 60,000 feet.
The first time you see a surface-to-air missile launched at you, the first time there's heavy anti-aircraft artillery, those are stressful, very stressful times. And even after all of the training, you never really know how you're going to handle that until the bullets are real.
So I saw this SAM, and I just started to break into it, which is lucky I didn't, because if I would have broken, this thing went off, it would have gone right through Willie and I through the cockpit.
Then the SAM exploded nearby.
Sounded like someone took 1,000 BBs and threw against, you know, your car. And the airplane kind of shook itself a little bit.
Maybe 15 seconds later, Duke says Willie was starting to lose PC2. That was one of our main hydraulics. As he said that, I looked back over the left side of the plane. I noticed the left turtleback area of the plane. There's fire on the side of the plane.
The Phantom skidded violently to the left. Then the backup hydraulics failed.
Duke comes back. Willie was starting to lose PC1. PC2 is going to 0.
It was a pilot's worst nightmare.
The airplane all of a sudden rolled upside down, out of control. And I remember thinking, the only time I'd ever asked for divine help is when I got in trouble, you know. And I remember thinking, God, I don't want to be a prisoner of war. I don't want to die. Get my rear end out of this.
With the backup hydraulic system gone, Cunningham rolled upside down, tilted the nose up so it wouldn't pitch down, and controlled the Phantom with the rudders. They rolled almost 20 times, descending from 27 to 17,000 feet, but kept close to the sea. To eject over land meant becoming a POW. Every second they could keep flying brought them nearer to the coast and rescue. As fire warnings blared, they stayed with their aircraft.
You have to get through that and have a firm enough grip on yourself to get done what has to be done at the moment.
The Phantom spun violently downwards. Cunningham and Driscoll were over enemy territory, on fire, and going down fast. The 10th of May, 1972, started well for Randy Cunningham and Willie Driscoll. They'd shot down 3 MiGs, but it may have been one fight too many. Wounded by a SAM missile, they'd spun out of control over North Vietnam.
Now there was a fire about 40 feet behind us. And Willie said, "Duke's getting hot back here." And I could see the fire out the mirrors. And I put the stick, and the airplane kind of righted itself. And I remember thinking, God didn't have anything to do with this. It was just my superior flying skills. But about that time, the airplane went back upside down, and I remember thinking, God, I didn't mean it. Get me out of here. I rolled the airplane some 30 miles using only rudder and power until the tail actually blew off, and the airplane went into a violent spin. Luckily, the radios were knocked out because there are people screaming at us on this tape. And they're saying, "Get out of that airplane, airplane in a spin over the beach, you know, get out of that airplane." I didn't hear any of that, which I was glad.
All right, get out of that airplane. Get out of that airplane. It's going down in a spin off the beach.
Finally, they cleared the coast.
The plane flipped onto its back. I did pretty much a handstand off the top of the canopy. When he gave me the Willie eject, 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 we have an alternate handle between our legs. That was a struggle to get to it. I just got a couple fingers on it, and they always taught us in training to keep our arms in so we don't break our arms. But I was kind of bent like a pretzel. Pulled it, and then bam, he went off one direction, I went off the other. We had like rockets in the back of the seat, so the rockets fired us out.
325, no DME, about 5 miles off the beach. Okay, stick with those.
Just moments after they'd ejected, their aircraft crashed into the sea. Both men were quickly rescued. With 5 kills, Cunningham and Driscoll were the first aces of the Vietnam War. Their squadron, the Fighting Falcons, would notch up the most air-to-air kills of any Navy unit in Vietnam. The Americans maintained total air superiority in the Vietnam War, forcing the North Vietnamese Air Force onto the defensive. After Vietnam, Cunningham served as an instructor at Top Gun, the Navy Fighter Weapons School. He retired in 1987 and went on to serve 8 terms as a congressman. Driscoll retired in 1988, was asked to join the U.S. Navy Reserve in 1990, and is a frequent guest speaker at the Navy's Top Gun School.
That's why Top Gun and the Air Force Fighter Weapons School exists, to help our pilots learn in training what they're going to need to know in combat to keep them alive and protect our country.
In 1973, the Phantom was replaced by the F-14 Tomcat. Because of the lessons learned in Vietnam, the Tomcat, a fast, nimble dogfighter, was armed with a gun, as were the later F-15, F-16, and the Navy's F-18 Hornet.
The F-18, for example, can, on a nose-low turn, can sustain 7.5 Gs. An F-4, by comparison, could only, in a situation like that, could sustain maybe 2 to 2.5 Gs. So it's a huge difference in performance ability.
But behind the technology, the basics remain the same.
If we have a missile, great, we can shoot them forward quarter. If we don't, we now have to apply those same concepts that Rickenbacker did and work ourselves behind him in the ability of shooting with our gun.
Modern fighters are also armed with the deadly 20mm Vulcan rotary cannon. A far cry from the 600 rounds per minute Vickers machine guns that forced Eddie Rickenbacker to close within 100 yards of his target. In the future, fighters like the F-22 Raptor will combine even greater maneuverability with higher sustained speeds and stealth technology that will render it nearly invisible to enemy sensors. The dogfight has been one of war's most intense forms of combat.
There were so many times where a second here or there could have meant life or death.
There's another saying that I think encapsulates what it's like to be a fighter pilot. When he sees the enemy, he attacks and kills. Anything else is rubbish. That was spoken by Baron von Richthofen in 1916.
If you get a little bit sloppy, or a little bit careless, or if you don't remember and employ all of the things that you've learned, all of the procedures, all of the techniques, you can die very quickly.
The progress from the First World War to the present is staggering. The SPAD-13 had a top speed of 130 miles per hour. The F-18 can hit 1,500. With aerial refueling, modern fighters have an almost unlimited range. Long-range modern sensors and missiles can strike to the horizon. But relying on high-tech can be a fatal mistake.
Radars go out, pilots make mistakes, missiles don't work. All kinds of things can happen during the mission to keep you from getting the kill that you think you're going to get at 25 miles and you don't get it at all.
Of the few who become fighter pilots, fewer still become aces.
I had gotten my 5th kill. I was now officially an ace, and I remember it made such an impression on me. While I was climbing out, I said, please, God, I know that you may have to take me before I get through this whole mess over here, but let me get home. Let me get home and tell somebody that I got my 5th kill and became an ace.
Manfred von Richthofen had 80 kills. Thomas B. McGuire with the United States Air Force had 38. Otto Kittel had 267. Now, all of these aces were successful because they applied tactics and techniques that were based on their strengths and their enemy's weaknesses. They took the fight to the enemy and fought on their own terms. But keep in mind, they also had one other thing in common. They were all killed in 1v1 air combat. You can't afford to let your guard down, and by no means should you ever go against your own recommendations or your own techniques.
You go beyond, you're going to lose the fight and possibly kill yourself and someone else.
What does make the difference between a great fighter pilot and a good fighter pilot? Call it a fighting spirit. You had to want to do it. You had to want to go up there every day and do it.
Dogfighting's obituary has been written time and time again, and has always been proved wrong.
I just don't ever see our country being in a position to not need a courageous, gutsy fighter pilot to do the job when the job needs to be done.
If a pilot is well-trained, aggressive, and has the will to win, he'll survive the ultimate test of air combat, the dogfight.
Stand by for an alien invasion after the break as experts pay a visit to the strange places, including Mexico's mysterious zone of silence that might just have been the homes of ancient extraterrestrials.